The main questions to which I am answering in my presentation are the following. First, is the official information in Russian archives about Ukrainian nationalists reliable? My answer is no. This is perhaps not surprising if we think about the factual contents of those documents. However, what I intend to say is that the imperial politicians wrote about Ukrainian national activists things in which they themselves did not believe. So it's not always reliable, even considering the opinions, real opinions of the authorities. And second question, of course, is why? Why on earth? Why did they include disinformation in their texts which were not published? My answer is they did this in order to convince those imperial politicians who either disapproved or could be expected to disapprove of the use of force against Ukrainian nationalism. Imperial government was not a monolith. There were different opinions, political discussions, and such an important measure like restrictions against Ukrainian publishing should have been discussed widely in the imperial bureaucracy if the decision was made in a regular order, but it wasn't. I come to this. If we think about the courses for the circular exclusive Ukrainian national identity, so that one cannot be Ukrainian and Russian at the same time, was of course in contradiction with the idea of a large all-Russian nation, which includes Great Russians, Little Russians, Belarusians. These were two conflicting ideas. And since the government officially supported the idea of a large all-Russian nation, it was bound to have difficulties in accepting Ukrainians as a separate nationality. Furthermore, among Ukrainian national activists, there was clear tendency to distance oneself as much as possible from Russia in cultural sense. And the authorities just could not help noticing that tendency. However, it was not a foregone conclusion that restrictions against the whole language were enacted. There were also more immediate courses for this measure, and I would name especially the Ukrainian demand for the use of Ukrainian in elementary education. This was a response to this Ukrainian demand. The Polish insurrection, of course, which began in January 1863, and also circulation of revolutionary ideas among the Ukrainian activists. Among important political figures during the reign of Alexander II, Pyotr Valuev, who sent the circular, was not a reactionary. We should actually look at what else did these people do, and not only concentrate on their Ukrainian policies. In this sense, Valuev is somewhat surprising if we think about him only in terms of his circular. His contribution was crucial to the enactment of the zemstvo, provincial and district administration, that was based on elected representatives from all social ranks. It was his intention to enlist elected representatives to the process of drafting new laws, and he submitted a relevant memorandum to Alexander II on 15th April 1863, not long before his circular, proposing that representatives of the nobility, merchants, burghers, and Orthodox Church clergymen participate in the sessions of the State Council and discuss new laws to be enacted. To be sure, Valuev envisioned those representatives as possessing only advisory prerogatives, without any limitation to the emperor's autocratic legislative power. Nevertheless, in the conditions of Russia in the 1860s, such a reform would have been significant, and it might have facilitated a subsequent switch to constitutional rule. Valuev's proposal was discussed in the Council of Ministers, but rejected by most participants, as well as Alexander II. Valuev's adherence to such an important step toward a more democratic political order seems to be at odds with his circular. However, this apparent inconsistency may be explained by his orientation on the interests of the nobility. Valuev's appointment in March 1861, immediately after the emancipation of serfs, as Minister of Internal Affairs was a concession to the conservative nobility. Valuev thought that the nobility deserved compensation for the losses that they had suffered as a result of emancipation of serfs. Furthermore, his sympathy for the nobility had an impact on his policy regarding the different nationalities of the Russian Empire. From 1853 to 1858, he served as the Governor-General of Courland in the Baltic region, where the nobility consisted of Germans, while the peasants spoke Latvian. How is it that Courland reappears in our symposium? He got along well with the local nobles, who held dear their traditional autonomous institutions. With regard to the Polish question, Valuev was one of the most moderate imperial politicians. He disliked repressions and would have preferred to reach an agreement with the local aristocracy. He granted some legitimacy to the autonomous strivings of the Poles and Baltic Germans, since both these groups had their own nobility, high culture and traditional institutions. However, Ukrainians were a predominantly plebeian nationality. Furthermore, it was not mainly the local nobility, but the populist-leaning intelligentsia that was leading the project to create a high culture in Ukrainian, at least if we simplify a bit. Valuev had little sympathy for any such plebeian national projects in general, and even less for the Ukrainian project in particular. So he was quite willing to live with German or Polish traditional languages of high culture, but Ukrainian was a different matter. Vasily Dolgorukov was chief of gendarmes, that is head of the Russian political police at the time. He was another one of the main architects of repressions against Ukrainian nationalists, because he found them politically subversive. Third section, the political police was relatively well informed about the political ideas which circulated among the Ukrainian activists. However, Ukrainian national activists used political strategy which made it difficult to counter them with regular police measures. They disseminated their ideas mainly through lawful, censored publications rather than clandestine and illegal ones. Restrictions against the whole language seemed to provide a solution to this problem. How to deal with the subversion between the lines, so to say. Through a number of political cases of, so to say, subversion, the government received reliable information about the political ideas which were circulating among Ukrainian nationalists. The most important of these was the case of Lieutenant Colonel and landowning nobleman Andrei Krasovsky. On 17 June 1862, Krasovsky was caught distributing copies of a handwritten proclamation among soldiers in Kiev, urging them to refuse to suppress the peasant disturbances in nearby villages. Krasovsky was at first sentenced to death, but later his sentence was changed into hard labor in Siberia. The authorities seized rather important documents in Krasovsky's possession. They included issues of Samostayne Slovo and Hromadnitsa, handwritten journals that were circulated among the members of the Kiev Hromada, local Ukrainian organization. Among topics discussed in these journals was future independence of Ukraine. However, they also contained texts against Polish claims to Ukraine and clearly indicated that Ukrainian activists were not just simply siding with Poles, but they had their own agenda, which was opposed to Polish claims. The materials indicated that Krasovsky himself personally sympathized with the Polish movement for independence, but they did not provide grounds to conclude that this would be the predominant opinion among the Ukrainian activists. This case, Krasovsky's case, moved Dolgorukov to adopt a more hostile and active position than previously regarding the Ukrainian activists. However, at this time there were still two important imperial politicians who preferred a tolerant policy on the Ukrainian question. Minister of Public Enlightenment Alexandr Golovnin and Governor General of Kiev Ilarion Vasylchykov. Up to March 1863, it was Golovnin's ministry which was in charge of censorship. For a minister of the Russian Empire, Golovnin was liberal. His idea was to establish the rule of law in censorship. The banning of any text should be based on standard rules rather than arbitrary decisions, and those rules should be published. However, as the Ministry of Internal Affairs, headed by Pyotr Valuev, constantly criticized censorship and tried to gain power over it, at first in 1862, Golovnin came to an arrangement giving a say in censorship to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. This proved intolerable because it meant that after the regular censors at the Ministry of Public Enlightenment, which is Ministry of Education, had passed texts, after that Ministry of Internal Affairs could criticize those decisions, and it was very bad for the censors in the Ministry of Public Enlightenment, and that's why Golovnin finally was happy to hand his control over censorship altogether to the Ministry of Internal Affairs in March 1863. Golovnin's attitude to the Ukrainian language may be characterized as purely imperial rather than Russian nationalist. He found no problem at all with the use of Ukrainian. After the enactment of the Valuev circular, he protested against it in very strong words, using the status of Finnish language as one of his arguments. This analogy demonstrates how to Golovnin, Ukrainian was not fundamentally different from any other minority language of the empire. Ilarion Vasylchykov, Governor General of Kiev, adopted the policy of cooperation with the Kiev Hromada, local Ukrainian organization, in spring 1861. This was a practical political decision which was not based on any deep principles held by Vasylchykov. The most important leader of Kiev Hromada, Volodymyr Antonovich, was interrogated by the authorities from February to April 1861, and he presented his political orientation as anti-Polish. Vasylchykov concluded that Ukrainians were a good balancing force against the Polish clandestine movement for independence, and abstained from repressions against them, against Ukrainians. Vasylchykov consistently defended Ukrainian activists against overzealous local authorities who arrested them and confiscated their publications. In his communication with St. Petersburg, he emphasized that no evidence existed about any subversion among the Ukrainian activists, and that the Ukrainians were against the Polish movement for independence. At this time, the imperial regional dignitaries like Vasylchykov were still rather powerful in their relation with the central imperial administration. It was not an easy task for the central ministries to bypass him or force him to change his Ukrainian policy. Powerful arguments were needed to counter him, and some of them were produced by using untraditional methods. On 29th June 1862, Minister of War Nikolai Milyutin forwarded to Dolgorukov a denunciation against the Kiev Ukrainophiles. Its author was Count Sievers, who had visited the city where he noticed the high visibility of the Ukrainian orientation and national dress. Sievers argued correctly that there was a connection between Krasovsky and the society of Chlopomans, as he called the Kiev Hromada. Krasovsky was a member. Dolgorukov forwarded the information to the emperor. In his letter, Sievers included also an anonymous denunciation in which it was claimed that Kiev Ukrainophiles were aiming at Ukraine's independence and acting in concert with the Polish underground, trying to incite the peasants against the existing order. The denunciation was clearly written by someone who was not satisfied with Vasylchykov's policy of cooperation between the authorities and the Hromada. Indeed, this unsubstantiated denunciation was the first one arguing the danger of Ukrainian-Polish revolutionary cooperation. The same denunciation claimed that the Ukrainian activist Pavlo Chubinsky had carried out agitation among the peasants of Poltava province. And this topic then kept recurring. More and more denunciations against Chubinsky arrived from Poltava. However, no evidence against Chubinsky was found, although authorities tried hard to find it. And the police discovered that at least some of the rumors were groundless. The only reliable information was that Chubinsky and other young men mixed socially with peasants and drank vodka with them. Finally, Gendarme Colonel Belov, stationed in Poltava, produced the handwritten proclamation to all good people and claimed that Chubinsky was suspected of being its author. The proclamation incited peasants to insurrection on the grounds that all the land was theirs, including the part that had remained in the possession of noble landowners after the land reform which accompanied the emancipation of serfs. However, Pyotr Savchenko was correct when he noted the possibility that the gendarmes themselves wrote this proclamation. He didn't take definite position concerning this question, but he just proposed that this is possible. And I indeed find it most likely that this is what happened. The author of the proclamation refers to the large fires that had caused extensive damage in the summer of 1862. He claims that among the arsonists were landlords who wanted to destroy the peasants economically, and the enemies of landlords who burned down only landlords' villages, so two kinds of arsonists. The peasants were urged not to pay any heed to the latter, the enemies of landlords, because the action was directed only against landlords who were their real enemies. It is extremely unlikely indeed that the Polish insurgents would have found it advantageous to defend arson in a text aimed at peasant audience. It was the Russian authorities, not the Polish insurgents, who in their discourse connected the fires with the Polish and radical Russian underground. Furthermore, the lack of any information about the proclamation's provenance in the files of the third section is striking. There's no information where, how, and when it was found, except for a statement that Chubinsky or his friends were suspected. Normally, gendarmes were interested in details when they wanted to find out the truth. Finally, Belov's letter, which contains the proclamation, seems to have been backdated to 7th September 1862. In the third section file, it is located after Valuev's information about the results of the police investigation about Chubinsky, dated 6th October 1862. Furthermore, on orders from Belov, his subordinate, Gendarme Lieutenant Vasilyev, forwarded information about Chubinsky to the third section on 20th September. Vasilyev's letter did not mention any proclamation. If the Poltava gendarmes had the proclamation in their possession on 7th September, it is puzzling that they wrote about Chubinsky to the third section on 20th September without making any reference to the proclamation. Furthermore, Chubinsky's case was investigated by the Commission for the Investigation of Political Crimes, headed by Alexandr Golitsyn. Contrary to its usual practice, the Commission recommended Chubinsky's deportation without questioning him or trying to gain any additional information. All this indicates that the gendarmes were the authors of Chubinsky's proclamation. And now I quote from this proclamation. It's interesting as a mirror image of, if we consider that it's been written by the authorities, how do the authorities find Ukrainian radicals of the time? What they find should be appropriate that they write. And forgive my Ukrainian pronunciation, I'm not Ukrainian and I'm not linguist. Добрі люди, ще і худобу вашу будуть пані утроювати, бо їх сила, одне їх воля, воля ваша. Не вважайте й то, що часом палають і панські села. То панські села палять панські вороги, а ваші вороги – пані. Повставайте, добрі люди. Спитайте стародавніх людей, що робили панам гайдамаки, як воно колись було, як гайдамаки подякували пана. Робіть так, як діди ваші. То буде ваша сила, бо ваша воля, ваша правда. Коли усі повстанете, то що вам хто зробить, вас багато. Уставайте тільки усі зараз, то ні пані, ні москалі вам нічого не зроблять, бо вас багато і ваша правда. Пані не хочуть давати землі, а земля вона ваша, уся ваша, бо ваші прадіди кров'ю її поливали і купували. Так чи довго ще катам панувати? Слухайте мене, добрі люди. Ждіть часу, поки усі будуть знати, та ставайте усі. І панські люди, і козаки, і міщани, і усі чесні люди. Бо пропадете усі до одного. Вас усіх заневолять ваші предковічні вороги, пані. Чи ж слава козацька пропала? Чи ви хочете бути старцями, та й діти ваші, щоб були у неволі? Що краще? Чи бути у неволі у пані, чи самим панувати? Ось розберіть, що тут написано, чи є тут у цьому писанню брехня. Щиро правду кажу вам. Бо приходить той час та година, що годі нам плакать, як мала дитина. Заприсягніть один перед одним, що усі повстанете рятувати один одного та битися з панами за правду, за волю, за косацьку долю. Бійте невірних, бо ще прийшов кінець панам, бо ви вольні усі, рівні.
Слава героям!
Чи є тут брехня? Є. The genre 13 of Chubinski's subversive tendency, but frustrated because of the lack of evidence, and because they wanted to discredit Governor General Vasylchykov's policy. So this was an indirect attack against Vasylchykov. We must take into account the inner intrigues of the imperial politicians. Chubinski was released from deportation only in 1869. Vasylchykov was completely sidelined in Chubinski's case. He was not consulted about it, but only afterwards informed about the decision concerning Chubinski's deportation. Because Chubinski had moved to Kiev from Poltava province, short distance, he actually had lived quite close to Kiev, although the border of the province was, although on the side of the Poltava province. It was Vasylchykov's duty to arrest and deport him. However, someone from Vasylchykov's chancellery leaked the news about Chubinski's imminent arrest to him one day before it took place. And the warning allowed Chubinski to get rid of any incriminating documents in his possession. For different reasons, it was in the interest of both Vasylchykov and Chubinski that the authorities did not find any hard evidence. The Governor-General did not want to foster criticism of his policies. If something was found on Chubinski, it would be used against him. So he was acting on his own interest when leaking this information to the Ukrainians. In the turn of the years 1862 and 1863, two important changes took place which paved the way to the Valuev circular. First, Vasylchykov unexpectedly died in December 1862. Second, in March 1863, censorship was transferred from the Ministry of Public Enlightenment to the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Without these changes, it's difficult to imagine that the Valuev circular would have been possible to enact. After some hesitation, Vasylchykov's successor Nikolai Nikolaevich Annenkov joined Dolgorukov and Valuev in their support of meting out repressions to Ukrainian national activists. In the end of January 1863, Dolgorukov wrote a strongly worded letter to Annenkov in which he informed the newly appointed Governor-General about the existence of the Hromada, a secret society that, according to Dolgorukov, was in contact with Polish regional organizations at the university, Polish student organizations. Dolgorukov ordered Annenkov to put an end to Hromada's activities. Thus, Vasylchykov's death had an impact on government policy. The Governor-General and the Third Section had known about the Kiev Hromada since 1861, but it became official news only now. Instead of being the government's allies against the Polish underground, Ukrainian activists in Kiev were now suspected of siding with the Poles. In early March, Dolgorukov reinforced his position by sending Annenkov a copy of an anonymous denunciation in which the planned translation of the Gospels was considered as a part of a campaign to separate Ukraine from Russia and join it in a federation with Poland. In his first responses, Annenkov was against repressing the Ukrainian activists. However, pressured by Valuev and Dolgorukov, he made up his mind and became an adherent of repression. On 17th March, Annenkov sent a letter to Dolgorukov in which he still denied that the Ukrainian activists had acted in unison with the Poles. Quite the contrary, they were opposed to Latin Polish propaganda. It's quite remarkable that even after he begins to support these repressions, he still denies the Polish connection. There was another staged political case staged by the authorities. Volodymyr Sinehu, a Hromada member and a dropout from secondary school, and his friend, the young nobleman Volodymyr Pilipenko, were arrested on 26 April 1863 in the village of Pilipchi in Poltava province. They were accused of recruiting members for a rebel unit to side with the Poles, and they at first admitted their guilt, but later on retracted and informed the authorities that they had been forced to sign dictated testimonies. And the testimonies are indeed bizarre, and I believe their version of the arrested that this was not their genuine testimony. What really took place was that the young Ukrainophile noblemen mixed socially with the peasants, drank vodka with them, and sang folk songs. No Little Russian Revolutionary Committee ever existed, which was as if found out in this case, uncovered in this case. Later on, Annenkov's successor as Governor General of Kiev, Alexander Pavlovich Besak, in 1865, informed the third section and the authorities in St. Petersburg in general about his opinion that there is no political subversion to be found in this case. The third section pressured Besak to change his opinion and even sent a list of 127 names, which included local inhabitants from all social classes and all the most prominent activists of the Kiev Hromada, and demanded that these people be interrogated. It took considerable perseverance on Besak's part to get his proposal accepted and close the case. Thanks to his resolve, Besak saved dozens of Kiev Ukrainophiles from arrests and perhaps arbitrary punishments. Why did the authorities at first want to punish Sinehu and other on trumped-up charges? It was not essential to remove Sinehu. Unlike Chubinsky, he was not a prominent Ukrainian activist and did not present any danger to the government. The most likely explanation is that Volkov, Poltava governor, and Dolgorukov needed an argument in defense of Valuev's circular, which was being prepared at the time. The official procedure that gave rise to the Valuev circular is well known. Formally, it was an initiative of the Kievan censor Orest Markovich Novitsky, who sent an inquiry about the matter to main administration of the press on 27 June 1863. Novitsky suspected that Ukrainian separatism owed its origin to a Polish intrigue. Contrary to the facts, the Kievan censor went so far as to claim that most Ukrainian language manuscripts submitted to the censorship were authored by Poles. A mere 6 days earlier, the influential Russian journalist Mikhail Nikiforovich Katkov had published a similar opinion in Moskovskie Vedomosti. Dolgorukov had already proposed the Polish intrigue theory of the origins of Ukrainian nationalism the previous January. The Valuev circular, which followed as a response to Novitsky's inquiry, was supported by Dolgorukov and endorsed by Alexander II. The text of the circular repeated Novitsky's claim that most Ukrainian language manuscripts submitted to the censorship were authored by Poles. However, the list of works submitted to the Kiev Censorship Committee, which I found in the files of main administration of press in Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg, tells us that in 1862 the committee received one Ukrainian language manuscript from a Polish author. So this was all fiction. Last but not least, I want to pay attention to the irregular way in which Valuev introduced the restrictions against Ukrainian publishing. He bypassed all regular advisory bodies, submitting the circular directly to Alexander II's approval. This was contrary to the established practice, according to which all new legislation was discussed in the State Council. This was an assembly of imperial dignitaries nominated by the emperor. It was not a parliament, for it only advised the emperor. However, very often different opinions were voiced in the State Council sessions, and voting took place frequently. Alexander II normally and usually favored free discussion in the State Council, only in the end choosing one of the competing opinions. If the restrictions on Ukrainian publishing were discussed in the State Council, opposition to them was bound to arise. There were several influential imperial politicians who either resisted the circular or were likely to oppose it during a session of the State Council. St. Petersburg Hromada counted among its members a member of the State Council who I have not been able to identify by name. Furthermore, the chairman of both the State Council and the Committee of Ministers was Dmitry Bludov, who on a previous occasions had been very strongly against suppressing Ukrainian publications. And Alexandr Golovnin, too, was a member of the State Council. So if all this were done in regular procedure, the outcome could have been different. An open political discussion among the imperial politicians about the restrictions against Ukrainian publications was something Valuev consciously and successfully avoided. The disinformation in official discussions was based on his consideration that victory might be difficult by using regular methods. He perceived his position as weaker than we tend to think today.
Thank you.